2. The divine rights of education. Education today occupies an equivocal position in contemporary life, functioning both as a scapegoat for every failure and as a catch-all for every hope and expectation of society. The schools and colleges are berated for extending their authority beyond the fundamentals of learning into a program which envelops the whole child or the whole man. And at the same time, they are given additional responsibilities which can only extend their scope even further. Fundamental to this unhappy and contradictory approach is a Messianic expectation of education coupled with a Messianic attitude on the part of educators. The attitude of people towards education is that it is a God that has failed, and yet a God who can perhaps still be whipped into fulfilling his mission. On all hands, there is a misconception as to the purpose, meaning, and function of education in life and society. Behind this misconception lies a centuries-old conflict between church, state, and school. Medieval thought, at times far more imperial than Rome, saw society as an indissoluble unit under the suzerainty of God's visible and manifest authority. According to the ruling ecclesiastical interpretation of the later Middle Ages, the Church was not only the continuation and extension of Christ's authority upon earth, but the bearer of his authority and kingship over all things in the universe. According to the familiar words of Boniface's bull Unum Sanctum 1302, we learn from the words of the Gospel that in this Church and in her power are two swords, the spiritual and the temporal. For when the Apostle said, "Behold, here, that is, in the church, since it was the apostles who spoke, are two swords," the Lord did not reply, "It is too much," but "It is enough." Truly, he who denies that the temporal sword is in the power of Peter misunderstands the words of the Lord. "Put up thy sword into the sheath," Luke 22:38. Both are in the power of the church, the spiritual sword and the material, but the latter is to be used for the church, the former by her, the former by the priest, the latter by kings and captains, but at the will and by the permission of the priest. The one sword then should be under the other, and temporal authority subject to spiritual. For when the Apostle says, "There is no power but of God, and the powers that be are ordained by God," John 18:11, they would not be so ordained were not one sword made subject to the other. Thus, concerning the church and her power, is the prophecy of Jeremiah fulfilled. "See, I have this day set thee over the nations and over the kingdoms," etc. John 1:19. If therefore the earthly power err, it shall be judged by the spiritual power, and if a lesser power err, it shall be judged by a greater. But if the supreme power err, it can only be judged by God, not by man. For the testimony of the Apostle is, "The spiritual man judgeth all things, yet he himself is judged of no man." 1 Corinthians 2:15. For this authority, although given to a man and exercised by a man, is not human but rather divine, given at God's mouth to Peter, and established on a rock for him and his successors, in him whom he confessed, the Lord saying to Peter himself, "Whatsoever thou shalt bind," etc. Matthew 16:19. Whoever therefore resists this power thus ordained of God, resists the ordinance of God. Furthermore, we declare, state, define, and pronounce that it is altogether necessary to salvation for every human creature to be subject to the Roman pontiff. Historians have unwittingly misinterpreted history by calling attention to the fact that Boniface VIII, in making these claims, met bitter hostility. Philip IV of France going so far as to summon the States General to formulate a charge of heresy and magic against the Pope and appeal to a general council for judgment. The insulting abuse of Boniface by French and Italian troops and his subsequent death as a defeated and broken man seem to indicate the failure of a grand idea, too audacious and extreme for his age to accept. In actuality, however, unum sanctum voiced only the commonplaces of the age, there being nothing new or novel in the presuppositions and doctrine expressed. The intensity of the opposition was precisely because the fundamental validity of the claims were recognized as true, but misappropriated. All were agreed that a supreme power, responsible only to God, existed. The question was, who constituted that power? Sacerdotium, imperium, and studium were the three basic powers or virtues of medieval society, whose harmonious functioning was basic to the life and health of Christendom. These three were not conflicting powers, but properly cooperating powers, whose harmonious and interlocking functionings were imperative to true society. Church, empire, and university believed in Christendom. They believed that unity was essential. Their conflicts were a result of differing opinions as to their respective functions and divinely given rights. As Rosenstock Hussey has pointed out, the Church, for centuries previously, had never been called una sancta, for the emperor and empire were the symbols of unity and source of authority. The Roman Church was only prima sedes, the first among many sees. On earth, the duty of maintaining visible uniqueness and unity belonged to the emperor. The popes of the first millennium refused steadfastly to be addressed as universal. Behind Dante's conception of the Holy Roman Emperor as true vicar lay a long record of historical actuality, of church reform accomplished by imperial power. Otto III exercised apostolic authority, using St. Paul's formula in his letters, calling himself Servus Jesus Christi. The motto of the empire was Jerusalem Visio Pacis. Against this, what Rosenstock Hussey aptly calls the Papal Revolution asserted at first no new categories of thought, but advanced a new claim as to the source of unity and authority, the papacy, with a new source of law resulting. The popes now called their canon laws by a new term, Ius Pauli, the law of the firmament. The Roman pontiff came to be known as Most Blessed Lord, Holy Father of Fathers, Pontiff of Christians, Pontiff of all Presidents, by automasia, ruler of the Church, Universal Archbishop, Universal Patriarch. His authority was not merely international, but rather universal. Thus, empire and papacy, church and state were at one with regard to the fundamental presuppositions of unum sanctum. The kingdom of God on earth had an earthly and visible authority in which the sovereignty and manifestation of God and his kingdom were revealed. Both the authentic authority and interpretation of that kingdom came from that one supreme power which could only be judged by God, not by man. The point of argument was, who is that supreme power? The Roman Church's answer has found developed formulation in the Vatican Council and the dogma of papal infallibility. The imperial answer led to the doctrine of the divine right of kings, the democratic concept of vox populi, vox dei, and the Hegelian and Marxist concepts of the historical process and the state. Society was unitary, authority was central, and was where the kingdom manifested itself, responsible only to God, and with all other authorities responsible to it and under it. The concept, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, underlies all modern thought. The difference lies in the interpretation of Lord, faith, and baptism. Again, authority is in every instance ultimately beyond judgment, whether manifested in the church, the king, the state, democracy, the people, or the proletariat, and the historical process. It asserts itself to be beyond human accounting and sufficient unto itself as far as its responsibility to other human agencies is concerned. Thus, it has a high concept of its own freedom and a strict concept of the limitations of other spheres of society. Lenin's words are accordingly understandable when he commented, "It is true that liberty is precious, so precious that it must be rationed." Whether they be philosopher kings, pontiffs, or leaders of the proletariat, true liberty can be given only to those having true authority. Freedom becomes both the privilege and responsibility of authority and a necessary condition to its operation. Freedom and authority have thus been closely linked, and the increase of authority in any one realm means a corresponding decline of freedom in another. The medieval church and state were thus deeply concerned with limiting one another. In the first millennium of the church's history, since no great threat existed to the state's manifest authority as the visible sovereignty of the kingdom of God, her attitude to church could be more liberal because it was paternalistic. The conflicts came with the church's claim to that same visible sovereignty. But an important and unduly neglected claim arose from another direction, the university. There were thus three areas claiming to be ministers of God and authentic priests and prophets, mediating and interpreting the kingdom of God. Priestly robes became not only the garb of the ecclesiastical hierarchy, but of the state, lawyers and judges declaring their priesthood in their black robes. The universities also, in their academic hoods and gowns, revealed their priestly role and origin as mediators and interpreters of the mysteries of the kingdom. Their graduates, bachelors, the young gentry or apprentices in the arts, students at universities who were foreigners had originally no legal rights, lacking local citizenship, and, as a result, came to be organized as guilds or nations, each having their rector, who served as a consul or bishop to protect the rights of citizens in an alien land. The recognition of student rights began as an outgrowth of certain conceptions of personal law and influenced by the contemporary guild movement, but it developed ultimately into a concept of independence of the university and its men as such from other authorities. Wherever a student or scholar was involved as plaintiff or defendant, the universities claimed for the rectors an exclusive jurisdiction in all cases, a claim comparable to the church's right to try priests in her own courts. The long political history of this claim is not our concern, but rather its relationship to the modern doctrine of academic freedom. Although, over a period of centuries, the immunity from civil law was gradually eliminated, the universities asserted increasingly in the areas of thoughts a concept of the same immunity. The world of the university was a priesthood and a brotherhood, a privileged realm, so that, in some Spanish universities, the new doctors were invested with the sword. In all universities, the ring formed one of the insignia of the doctorate, and at Vienna the preliminary bath of the candidate for knighthood appears to have been imitated by candidates for degrees. Scholars were thus a brotherhood, a priesthood, a knighthood, whose importance was not lost on church or state, both of whom sought to control this third power, either by limiting the study of secular law or by emphasizing it in order to have an ally in the university. Beginning with Charles V, for example, the University of Paris was called the eldest daughter of the king. The university had a privileged place both in the States General in France, for example, and in the church by virtue of the priestly status of scholars. For some time, the University of Paris exercised a, quote, theological dictatorship, end quote, in the church. Again and again, Paris led the way, and Rome followed. Pope Alexander IV was compelled to condemn the Franciscan, everlasting gospel. Later, Pope John XXII, in another controversy involving the Franciscans, was reprimanded by Paris and brought to a humble apology for daring to offer a pronouncement on matters of faith. The Council of Constance, 1414 to 1418, was an instance of the power of the University of Paris, but When no council was sitting, the University of Paris was able to act as a sort of standing committee of the French, or even of the Universal Church. Paris became the first school of the Church, the theological arbiter of Europe, and exercised a theological dictatorship. At Constance, not only was Pope John the 23rd deposed, but the superiority of the council over the Pope asserted. In its fourth session on March the 30th, with the Emperor Sigismund present, the direct authority of the council from Jesus Christ was asserted, an authority which every person, including the Pope himself, must obey in all matters pertaining to the faith, the extirpation of schism, and in the reformation of the Church in its head and in all its members. In 1682, the session and its decrees, together with the fifth session, was approved in full and received by the clergy of France. On May the 14th, Pope John the 23rd, in submitting to the council, recognised it as holy and infallible, although against his will. Between the 42nd and 43rd sessions, the new Pope, Martin V, confirmed the acts of the council. The Council of Basel in 1431 reaffirmed these principles, and when Pope Eugene resisted, the council named Amadeus Pope under the name of Felix V, and he was so recognised by various monarchs and princes, and the universities of Germany, Paris, and Krakow. A century later, the power of the University of Paris was officially recognised by Pope Benedict XII, himself a DD of the Cistercian College of Paris, when he began the custom of officially notifying his election to the university, which was thus recognised as one of the great powers of Europe. The failure of the councils was a failure of the universities as well. They represented a professionalism concerned mainly with reforming the workings of the Church rather than the Church itself, of ending scandal rather than the source of scandal. The councils did nothing to further reform. They functioned to destroy it at Constance. They did not challenge the concept of authority, they questioned its current location. The result was the failure not only of the conciliar movement, but of the universities, and their consequent decline. In recent years, scholars have endeavoured to show that the universities of the later Middle Ages were neither as devoid of students or of competent studies as sometimes assumed, but this is not the point. What happened was that, while functioning as a necessary part of professional machinery of the age, the universities became increasingly irrelevant to the temper of the age, a relevancy restored by Luther. The Reformation was born in a university, and it gave renewed status and power to the university throughout Europe. Why were the universities so powerful? Arab scholarship was meaningless in terms of Muslim culture, the scholars merely court favourites without standing. Scholarship was suppressed and books burned without leaving a ripple of influence except on Christendom. Thus, while Arab scholarship was at times freer and bolder, it was Christian scholarship which had a vital relationship to its society and an authority accordingly. The university was more than a mere creature of the church or state, although both hoped to limit it to the role of an adjunct. In both realms, the scholar had a recognized authority. In Bologna, for example, the rector was formally recognized as ranking above all cardinals and archbishops. Students themselves were able to assert and gain extensive powers. Moreover, universities sought independence, securing benefit of clergy for their members, jails in Germany for their own courts and members, and, as in England, their own representatives in Parliament. Both church and state could claim authority from Scripture, Romans 13 and other passages asserting the ministerial status of magistrates as well as pastors. What the university came to possess was, in effect, a third ministry, that of reason. Although by 1300 the lawyers tried to theorize that no university could be founded except by a pope or monarch, they had to admit that, in actuality, valid creation could have its source in long custom, ex consuetudine. Of the 14 universities of 1300, 9 had their origin ex consuetudine, 3 had been founded by princes, and only 2 by popes. Yet the university spoke with an authority that at times made the papacy defer to it. The reason for this independence is twofold. Its origin was in the biblical concept of the divine ministry and the Greek conception of the ideas, forms, types, and reason. Status in medieval society required authority, divine authority. Although professionalism prevailed and church office was no place for a saint or a reformer, still the management and control of the machinery required divine authority. In democratic nations, ballot boxes have been stuffed by politicians already in control, not because they could not seize or retain control without benefit of vote, but because the concept of authority they shared required the formal approval of the ballot box, however secured, to ensure legitimacy. The Middle Ages were no different. However cynical the purely professional clergy might be, they could only conceive of power as founded on divine authority. God had ordained 2 powers, church and state, each culminating in a head, pope and emperor. To resist them was to resist God, and the question of legitimate rebellion against divine authority was one requiring divine justification or authority, which indeed political theorists and conciliar advocates earnestly sought. The scholar, historically, had a relationship to both domains. Greek thought regarded the universe not with the principle of discontinuity held to by biblical thought, but in terms of continuity. There was no radical distinction between creator and creature, God and man, but rather a scale of being, with differing degrees of participation in being. Man's autonomous reason was capable both of understanding and participating in this scale of being. There was no conception of God as self-sufficient and absolutely independent, nor was there a true concept of creation. Neither was it necessary to know God in order to interpret creation. The human mind, freely and independently, was regarded as capable of knowing reality and understanding all facts without reference to God. The Greek conception of reason was closely related to its conception of the soul. Plato sometimes spoke of the soul as having 3 parts or functions: reason, will, and sensuous appetites, with reason being its rational nature, and will the noble part of its irrational nature, and the sensuous appetites the ignoble. At times he spoke of all 3 parts, and at other times the soul only, as immortal. Aristotle's concept of the soul was closely related to this concept of enteleke, and man's real self is rational rather than vegetative and appetitive souls. Man's rational soul guided him in his development and made it possible to consider the mind as actualized body and the body as potential mind. In this impulse upward to realize perfect form, Plotinus tied the soul and reason more closely to the Godhead. Because Greek thought had no conception of an independent and self-sufficient God who is the source of all true authority, it could not develop the authority of this God-related reason. For the Greeks, authority came from the polis, not from God. Its deity, when manifest as authority, was immanent and not transcendent, and lacking in more than local scope, usually in terms of the city-state. Now, 2 concepts were brought together with great potentialities. For the Greeks, the soul was an intimate relation with the world of ideas, but not itself an idea, having a vision of reality, the ideas, and being immortal. Medieval Christianity developed a concept of authority in terms of a transcendent and self-sufficient God. Aquinas maintained that the end of the universe must be the good of the intellect, which is truth. This intellect, independent and autonomous in its functions, had, by its nature, an independence of human authority implicit within it, and in addition was linked with God in the scale of being. Revealed truth came from God. Reason constituted a separate realm of interpretation which could be shown to be in agreement with the Christian religion. Man ascended by means of the creatures to the contemplation of God, rising step by step in the contemplation of being to the divine truth, with other truths perfecting and preparing the intellect for divine truth. The principle of interpretation thus comes from man and is applied to God rather than derived from God and applied to creation, and the superimposition of revelation cannot eliminate this important rule of reason. For the consistent Calvinist, by way of contrast, one common principle prevails in regard to reason, revelation, science, all knowledge, namely that God as creator is also the only interpreter of creation. But for scholasticism, reason, while guided and controlled by revelation, had nevertheless an independence and autonomy. It confirmed revelation on independent grounds. It had an independent voice and an independent power, one which had to be controlled because its independence and move to autonomy were recognized. The Church thus both expressed its doubts of Aristotle as well as its approval of him within a few years. Reason, in terms of the medieval use of Aristotle, had a tremendous power because of its relationship to God and the soul. It had an authority not possible in non-Christian thought. It could constitute a threat to the Church and also a great bulwark to its authority. Both Church and State needed this support. The three great authorities of the Middle Ages came to be Church, State, and Reason, and none was above suspicion. Herein was and is the ground of the university's power. The Church was the authoritative institution representing revelation, and the State sought its authority not only from revelation, but in natural law. The university could rely on the authority of reason, as recognized by Church and State and utilized for their own ends. If reason was often in bonds, and the university with it, it was because it was recognized as being a veritable Samson. If often distrusted, it was because it was seen as a Daniel, possessing great power and authority directly from the throne, and yet somehow alien to it. The power of the Christian scholar in university was strongly asserted by Luther, as Rosenstock-Hussey has pointed out. This was done in the new biblical confidence in the authority of God and the power of true faith. When, in March 1552, Luther left his hiding place in the Wartburg near Eisenach, he attempted to reassure the troubled and distressed Prince Elector by offering him his protection. Frederick had only his secular power, but Luther had the authority of God. The voice of the prophet speaking to the kings of Israel, the voice of Paul speaking before the governors of Rome, was made a public institution of the German nation when Luther offered Frederick his protection. As a result, the universities became the heirs of the bishop's chair, the cathedra. These catheders became a church-like institution, like the commons in England. The chairs of universities derived all their authority from the fact that they were Christian chairs of the German nation. The universities represented the life of the Holy Ghost in the German nation. Teaching was a public trust, and the public in Germany thought of the universities as keepers of the nation's conscience. This salvation character of scholarship, utterly foreign to the rest of the world, is a religious key to the political building erected by the Reformation. This situation ended only in 1918 to 1933, but was dying in its Christian significance for some time previously. The salvation character of scholarship and education was not limited to Germany, however, although best then there and most systematically Christian. Elsewhere, on the basis of the medieval concept of reason, without Luther's emphasis, the university gradually developed its concept of academic freedom, that is, an independent authority for reason and scholarship, which made it responsible to none other, and its concepts of the redemptive, authoritative, and power-endowing nature of knowledge, of reason, of university and school